The ride home from the hospital took 40 minutes. I remember watching the city blur past the window of that black sedan, the late afternoon sun cutting through the glass and landing on my hand, the same hand that still had a small bruise where the IV needle had been. 3 days. I had been gone for only 3 days. A cardiac arrhythmia, my cardiologist called it. Nothing catastrophic, he said, just your heart reminding you that you are 71 years old, Richard, and that you have been carrying too much weight for too long. He meant stress. He did not know how right he was. The sedan turned onto Maple Grove Drive, and I recognized every tree on that block. I had planted most of them myself 34 years ago when my wife Diane and I moved into the white colonial at the end of the cul-de-sac. My hands had pressed those saplings into the cold November ground. My knees ached for weeks afterward. I paid off that house in 11 years. I built everything around it. The rental properties, the commercial lots, the storage facilities, the small office park on Route 9, with the same hands, the same discipline, and not a single favor from anyone. The sedan stopped at the curb. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my house key, the original brass key I had carried on the same ring for 30 years, and I walked up the front path. The key did not turn. I tried again. Nothing. I pulled it out, examined it in the gray October light, put it back in. Still nothing. I pressed my palm flat against the door and pushed just to be certain I wasn't confused. The door did not move. Someone had changed the locks on my house while I was lying in a hospital bed with electrodes on my chest. I stood on my own front porch for a long moment, breathing the cold air, listening to the silence of that street I had lived on for 34 years, and I felt something settle in my chest, low and very still. Not anger, something colder than anger. Something I had felt only once before in my life, 40 years ago, when a business partner tried to steal a construction contract from me and smiled to my face while doing it. The feeling that said, this is going to cost them everything. Before I tell you what happened on the other side of that door and exactly how I dismantled every financial structure my daughter-in-law had spent 2 years building around herself and my son, I want you to know that 48 hours later, Monica was sitting in a county sheriff's office with a court-issued eviction notice in her hand, and she was crying to a deputy about how unfair everything was. The deputy looked at the documents. Then he looked at her, and he said very quietly, "Ma'am, the property owner has the right to take back possession of a property that was never legally transferred to you." She said my name like it was a curse. The deputy said nothing. He had already seen the deed. Tell me in the comments where you were watching this from, and if you have ever had someone in your family mistake your silence for weakness. If you have ever been underestimated by someone you trusted, click like before we go further, because what I am about to tell you took me 6 months to live through, and I want you to stay until the very end. My name is Richard Caldwell. I am 71 years old, and for 43 years I built commercial real estate properties in upstate New York the way my father taught me to build anything, one foundation at a time, with materials you could trust, and never more debt than you could service in a bad season. I started with a single vacant lot on the east side of Albany, purchased with my savings from 6 years of working construction in my 20s. I cleared it myself, I poured the foundation myself. I built a 4-unit rental building that stood for 30 years without a single major structural failure. That building paid for the next one. That one paid for the one after that. By the time I was 55, I owned 14 commercial properties across 3 counties, a storage facility complex, and a small office park that housed 8 small businesses. I had 41 employees at the peak of our operations, and every single one of them knew my name and what I stood for. My wife Diane was the only partner I ever had who was truly indispensable. She kept the books for the first 12 years before we had a full accounting department. She raised our son, Derek, while I worked 18-hour days. She sat next to me through 2 recessions and 3 failed projects and never once suggested we quit. She died 14 months ago of ovarian cancer after an 11-month fight that she faced with more composure than I could have managed. I was holding her hand when she went. I have not slept well since. I mention Diane not for pity, but because you need to understand what kind of man I was when Monica decided I was an obstacle to be removed. I was a grieving 70-year-old man who had just buried his wife and who, in that grief, made the single greatest strategic mistake of my adult life. I let my guard down inside my own family. My son Derek married Monica 6 years ago. She was 32 at the time, well-dressed, quick with a compliment, and strategically attentive to me whenever Derek was in the room. I noticed. I'm a businessman. I noticed things. But Derek was 40 years old, and he loved her, and Diane liked her well enough, and I told myself that my instincts about people had occasionally been wrong. They moved into the Maple Grove house 2 years ago, 3 months after Diane's diagnosis. The plan, as Derek explained it, was that he and Monica would move in to help care for Diane and to keep me company. I agreed. The house was a 4-bedroom colonial with a finished basement and a detached garage. There was more than enough room. I was grateful for the company. Diane was grateful for the help. And for the first 3 months, everything was fine. What I did not fully register in my grief and my exhaustion was how thoroughly Monica was conducting an audit of everything I owned. She offered to help me organize my paperwork after Diane passed. I accepted. She asked, very gently, whether I had considered updating my estate documents. I said I had a lawyer who handled those things. She nodded and smiled and did not push. She asked about the properties, casually, conversationally, over dinners. She asked which ones were most valuable, which ones were paid off, which ones still carried mortgages. I answered honestly because she was my son's wife, and I am not a man who hides from my own family. I answered, and I watched her file the information away behind those careful eyes, and I told myself it was just curiosity. Derek, for his part, had changed. Slowly, over those 2 years, the son who had grown up watching me work 16-hour days had become a man who spoke mostly in his wife's language. When I said something Monica disagreed with, Derek was quiet. When Monica needed something from the family finances, Derek was the one who brought the request to me. He was not cruel. He was simply no longer his own person, and that was a grief of a different kind than losing Diane, but a grief nonetheless. The hospital incident was 3 months ago. I had been having irregular heartbeats for 2 weeks before the arrhythmia event. My cardiologist, a careful and thorough man named Dr. Huang, admitted me for observation and a minor procedure. I told Derek before I went in. He nodded and said he hoped I felt better. Monica was on the phone in the next room. She did not come to the hospital, not once, in 3 days. What she did instead was drive to the hardware store on the morning of my second day in the hospital and purchase a new deadbolt lock and a new handle set and had a contractor install them on the front door of my house before noon. I know this because the neighbor across the street, a neighbor who had known Diane for 22 years, named Helen, texted me. I was in my hospital gown, connected to a cardiac monitor, reading her text. "Richard, there is a van in your driveway and a man changing your front door locks. Is everything okay?" I stared at that message for a long time. Then I thanked her and told her I was fine. I was not fine, but I was thinking very clearly, which is a different thing entirely. Standing on that front porch with my useless key in my hand, I did not knock, I did not call Derek's name. I walked back to the sedan, asked the driver to take me to a hotel downtown, and I checked into a room on the 7th floor. I ordered room service. I sat in an armchair by the window, and I watched the city lights come on, and I started making a list. The first call I made was to Victor Lang, my attorney, a silver-haired man of 58 who had drafted every business document I had signed for 30 years. I reached him on his cell phone at 7:15 in the evening. I described what had happened. He was quiet for 4 seconds, which for Victor is a long time, and then he said, "I need you to tell me exactly what paperwork Monica had had access to." I told him everything. I described every conversation, every document she had seen, every question she had asked over 2 years. By the time I finished, it was past 9 o'clock.
Victor said, "Richard, I want you to stay exactly where you are. I am going to make some calls tonight." What Victor discovered over the next 72 hours was considerably worse than a changed lock. During the months when I was most consumed by Diane's illness and death, Monica had been building a paper structure around the properties. She had drafted, using an online legal document service, a gift deed purportedly signed by me, transferring the Maple Grove house from my name to both Derek's and hers jointly. The document had a notarization stamp on it that Victor's investigator determined was fraudulent within 48 hours of looking at it. She had also filed paperwork with my property management company representing herself as my authorized agent and had redirected the rental income from 2 of my smaller properties totaling $11,000 per month into a joint checking account that she and Derek controlled. For 8 months, $11,000 a month of my rental income had been flowing into an account I did not know existed. Victor also found something I had not expected. Monica had retained her own attorney, a man who specialized in elder law, and had begun the preliminary documentation for a petition of guardianship, arguing that my grief following Diane's death had left me cognitively impaired and financially incompetent. She had medical appointment notes selectively quoted. She had financial records showing inconsistencies that existed because she had been redirecting my income without my knowledge. She was building the case brick by brick that I could not manage my own affairs, and she intended to have herself appointed as my legal guardian before I understood what was happening. The cardiac event had accelerated her timeline. She had seen her window and she had moved. I sat with all of this information in that hotel room on the 3rd night, with Victor's summary on the table in front of me and a cup of cold coffee that I had not touched. I thought about Diane. I thought about what she would have said if she could have seen this. She would not have been surprised. She had never trusted Monica's attentiveness. She had said it to me once, quietly, a week before she died. "Richard," she said, "watch that woman carefully. She loves what you built more than she loves your son." I had not wanted to believe her. I believed her now. In 43 years of building properties, I learned one thing about structural failure. The moment you discover a problem is not the moment to act. The moment to act is after you have mapped every crack, documented every compromised beam, and confirmed that the entire damaged section is isolated. You do not tear out one bad wall and leave the rot behind it untouched. You do not give the problem time to hide itself. You wait, you document, and then you remove everything completely and permanently. Monica had had 2 years to build her structure. I was going to give myself 30 days to dismantle it, not because I was patient, because I was precise. I called Derek only once during those 30 days to let him know I was staying with an old friend while I recovered. He asked if I needed anything. I said no. He did not ask when I was coming home. I took that as its own kind of answer. Victor brought in a forensic accountant on day 4, a methodical woman named Patricia Malone who had spent 20 years working financial fraud cases for a federal agency before going private. She worked through my records, the redirected accounts, the fraudulent deed, and the guardianship documents with the kind of quiet efficiency that I recognized as genuine competence. She said very little. She documented everything. On day 9, Victor informed me that the fraudulent deed and the unauthorized account activity constituted wire fraud and elder financial abuse under New York state law. He had already been in contact with the Albany County District Attorney's Office. A detective named Brian Walsh was assigned to the case. On day 12, I met Patricia at a diner on the edge of the city where nobody knew me, and she slid a folder across the table. 8 months of redirected income, a fraudulent notarization on a state deed, preliminary guardianship documentation built on fabricated evidence of cognitive decline. Everything documented, time-stamped, cross-referenced with my actual medical records showing no cognitive impairment whatsoever. On day 15, Victor filed a civil complaint against Monica and Derek, seeking immediate restitution of all diverted funds and legal costs, plus damages. He also contacted Detective Walsh with the complete document package. On day 22, Victor confirmed that the arrest warrants were ready. Monica's attorney, the elder law specialist, had been notified by the Bar Association that he was under investigation for his role in preparing fraudulent guardianship documentation. He withdrew from the case that afternoon. I spent those 30 days in a quiet hotel room with a view of the Hudson River. I slept better than I had in months. I ate regular meals. I called Victor every evening at 6 o'clock for a status update, the way I used to review construction site reports when I was running active projects. I read. I took walks by the water in the morning. I did not contact Derek or Monica. I let them live in the house, comfortable, confident, certain that the old man had folded. I had folded nothing. On day 29, I asked Victor one final question. Is everything in place? He said yes. I said, then let's finish it. On the 30th day, I called Derek. I told him I wanted to come by the house and collect some things of Diane's. I said I had been thinking things over, and I understood he and Monica needed space. I told him I was considering signing the property over to them properly and wanted to discuss it in person. My voice was tired and a little slow, not because I was performing exactly, but because I had made a choice not to hide the weariness in it. I was tired. I had been tired for 14 months. It was just that the weariness was no longer blinding me. Derek put Monica on the phone. She told me they would be home at 3 in the afternoon. She told me I thought it was wise that I was being realistic. She used that word, realistic, as though accepting what she had taken was a form of wisdom. I said I would see them at 3. I arrived at 2:45. I had a locksmith with me to regain access to my own front door. We used the original deed of ownership and the court order Victor had prepared. The locksmith worked quickly. I walked into the house I had built my life around, and I sat in the armchair in the living room, Diane's armchair, the one she had read in for 30 years, and I waited. Monica's car pulled into the driveway at 3:02. She came through the door already speaking before she had even seen me fully, something about paperwork she wanted me to look at. Then she stopped. She looked at me in the chair. She looked at the locksmith who was packing his tools in the front hallway. She looked at Victor, who was standing near the window in his dark suit with a folder under his arm. She looked at Detective Brian Walsh, who was in plain clothes near the kitchen door with 2 uniformed officers behind him, and she understood. She turned to find Derek, who had come in behind her and now stood very still in the doorway, reading the room. I looked at my son. He was 42 years old, and in that moment he looked like a boy who had followed someone somewhere and arrived to find that the place was nothing like he had been told. I gave him one look, one, that said, you know what you did, and you know what you allowed, and whatever happens now is a consequence of choices you made. He looked away first.
Victor stepped forward and handed Monica the civil complaint. He explained it clearly and without emotion, the way a very good attorney explains things to people who are no longer in a position to negotiate. The complaint outlined the fraudulent deed, the wire fraud, the diverted rental income, the falsified guardianship documents, and the fraudulent notarization. He told her the total amount of diverted funds with interest that she was being held liable for. The number was just over $94,000. Monica said, "This is ridiculous." Her voice was still controlled, but I could hear the edge in it, the first real sound of something unscripted coming through the performance. Victor said, "That is your right to claim in court, Miss Hartley." He still called her by her maiden name. She had never legally changed it, a detail she likely considered advantageous and that now simply made the paperwork cleaner.
Detective Walsh stepped forward then. He identified himself. He told Monica that she was being arrested on 2 counts of elder financial abuse under New York state law, 1 count of filing a fraudulent deed with a county records office, and 1 count of attempted fraudulent guardianship proceedings. He told her she had the right to remain silent. He told her what that right meant. She looked at Derek. Derek said nothing. He was looking at the floor. Monica said, in a voice that had dropped all its warmth and sounded like something metallic scraping a surface, "Derek, do something." Derek raised his eyes to her, and for the first and only time in those 2 years, he made a decision that was entirely his own. He said, very quietly, "I think you should go with him, Monica." She did not go quietly. There was noise, the kind of noise that fills a house and then empties it. The neighbors likely heard. Helen, across the street, later told me she saw the patrol car and came out to her porch. I do not know what she thought. I know what she later told me she felt, which was, finally. The fraudulent deed was voided by the county clerk's office the following morning, returning the Maple Grove house fully and unambiguously to my sole ownership. The redirected rental accounts were frozen and the funds held pending court order. Monica's attorney, the second one she retained after the first withdrew, advised her to accept a plea agreement rather than face a full trial. She did. She was sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation, community service, mandatory financial restitution, and a permanent injunction against any contact with my financial affairs. Derek filed for divorce 6 weeks later. I believe it was the first decision he had made for himself in 6 years. I did not celebrate it. I felt only a complicated sorrow for a man who had let someone else build his life for him and who now had to learn, at 42, what building actually required. The financial restitution, when it arrived, I did not spend on myself. I knew exactly where it belonged. I moved back into the Maple Grove house in November, 1 year and 3 months after Diane had left it for the last time. I sat in her armchair that first night, and I did not try to feel anything particular. The house was the same house. The floors were the same. The kitchen smelled faintly of the lavender soap she had kept by the sink, because I had replaced the bottle with the same brand. Small faithfulness, I suppose, but small faithfulness is something. I sat with Victor the following week, and we revised my estate documents completely. My attorney as trustee with a succession plan that did not include a single person who had not earned that trust through their own actions. I named the Diane Caldwell Memorial Scholarship at the Albany Nursing School she had attended before she met me as the primary beneficiary of the trust's income for the first 10 years. She had always said she regretted not finishing that degree. I could not give her that, but I could give it to someone else. I also called each of my 14 long-term tenants and property managers personally, not to tell them what had happened, but to tell them that business would continue normally, that their leases were secure, and that I appreciated every year of our working relationship. 3 of them had already heard something through the county records office. Small cities are small cities, and they called me back to say they were glad I was all right. One of them, a man who had leased a unit in the Route 9 office park for 11 years and who had sent a card when Diane died, said, "Mr. Caldwell, we never doubted you for a second." I am not a man who cries easily, but I held the phone a moment longer than necessary before I thanked him and hung up. I did not hear from Derek for 4 months. When he finally called, he did not make excuses.
He said he was sorry. He said he had known something was wrong and had told himself it was not his business. He said he was in therapy and trying to understand how he had become someone he did not recognize. I listened. I did not offer forgiveness immediately because forgiveness that costs nothing is worth nothing, and I wanted him to know that rebuilding trust is the same as building anything else. It requires time, materials you can stand behind, and no shortcuts. I told him to call me in another month. He said he would. He did. We are not where we were. We may never be where we were, but we are somewhere, which is more than I could have said a year ago. I want to say one thing before I go. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being underestimated by someone who lives inside your own life. It is not the exhaustion of hard work, which I have always found clarifying. It is the exhaustion of having to be strong in a place where you expected to be able to rest, of keeping your face still when what you feel inside is a grief so wide and so complicated that you are not sure what to call it. I kept my face still. I did the work. I remembered who I was even when someone very close to me was building a case that I had forgotten. Diane used to say that the best construction is always invisible, that when a foundation is perfectly laid, nobody looks at it. They just live in the house, never thinking about what holds it up. She meant it as a compliment. She was talking about the kind of work I do, but I have come to think she was talking about something else too. She was talking about the work of being a person of integrity, quietly over a long time, in a world that sometimes forgets to notice. The foundation is invisible because it has always been there. It holds the house up whether anyone is looking or not. I am still here. The house is still standing. The locks are back under my control. And that, as it turns out, is enough.